Henry's Mercedes glided smoothly into the driveway, the quiet purr of the engine fading into the evening stillness. He had cut short his business trip, eager to surprise Emily after days of tense negotiations and late-night strategy sessions. The California sunset painted streaks of gold and pink across the sky, casting a warm glow over the upscale neighborhood where their spacious home stood as he stepped through the front door. A wave of exhaustion mingled with anticipation washed over Henry. He dropped his briefcase by the door inside, grateful to be home early for once. He called out to Emily, expecting her usual cheerful greeting, but the house was eerily quiet. Suspicion flickered in Henry's mind as he ascended the stairs to their bedroom. "Is she not home?" he wondered briefly, but the faint sounds drifting down the hall told him otherwise. Muted whispers, the rustle of sheets, a stifled laugh. Henry approached their bedroom door with a mix of apprehension and hope. He turned the knob slowly, the door creaking softly as it swung open. What he saw inside shattered his world in an instant. There, on their plush king-size bed, Henry's eyes fell upon a scene that froze him in place, a scene of betrayal etched in vivid detail. Emily, his wife of 15 years, lay tangled with another man, their bodies intertwined in a way that spoke volumes of intimacy and deceit. The man, a stranger to Henry, scrambled to sit up, his face flushed with embarrassment and guilt. For a timeless moment, Henry stood rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to comprehend the sight before him. He felt a surge of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a profound sadness that pierced his heart like a knife. He had trusted Emily implicitly, believed in the sanctity of their marriage despite their differences and occasional arguments about money and lifestyle. "Emily," Henry finally managed to speak, his voice hoarse with restrained anguish. His gaze moved from Emily's tear-streaked face to the man beside her, whose eyes avoided his like a criminal caught red-handed. Emily's eyes widened in a mix of horror and shame as she scrambled to cover herself with the tangled sheets. "Henry, I can explain," she stammered, her voice trembling with desperation. The man, sensing the gravity of the situation, attempted to speak, but faltered under Henry's piercing gaze. He fumbled with his clothes, muttering apologies that fell hollow against the weight of Henry's silent accusation. Henry remained silent, his jaw clenched tightly as he struggled to maintain composure. He turned away, unable to bear the sight of his wife entwined with another man, the betrayal too raw and agonizing to confront head-on. With deliberate steps, Henry walked out of the bedroom. His mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions and unanswered questions, the door clicked softly shut behind him, sealing off the scene of betrayal and leaving Emily alone with the echoes of her indiscretion. Alone in the aftermath, Emily collapsed onto the bed, tears streaming down her face as she buried her head in her hands. Regret and guilt consumed her, mingling with the overwhelming sense of loss and the devastation of Henry's silent condemnation. Minutes stretched into eternity as Emily grappled with the consequences of her actions. How had she let it come to this? The allure of excitement and the thrill of forbidden desire had clouded her judgment, blinding her to the repercussions of her infidelity. The sound of Henry's footsteps downstairs shattered the oppressive silence, drawing Emily's gaze to the closed bedroom door. She knew he had left without a word, his departure a stark testament to the depth of his hurt and betrayal. Tears blurred her vision as she replayed the scene in her mind, wishing desperately for a chance to undo the irreversible. A sudden ringing broke through her thoughts, causing Emily to startle. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, her heart pounding in her chest. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, and a knot tightened in her stomach as she answered, unaware that this call would mark the beginning of a nightmare she could never have imagined. After the devastating confrontation in their bedroom, Emily sat numbly on the edge of the bed, her mind reeling with a tumult of emotions. Henry's unexpected reaction had left her bewildered and unsure of what would come next. She watched him leave the room without a word, his face a mask of quiet anguish that cut deeper than any outburst could have, as the door closed softly behind him. Emily was left alone with the weight of her betrayal. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mingling with the bitter taste of regret. She had expected Henry to erupt in a storm of anger, to shout and accuse her, But his silence spoke louder than words. It spoke of hurt, of disappointment, of a shattered trust that may never be repaired. Days passed in a haze of strained normalcy. Emily went through the motions of daily life, preparing meals, running errands, tending to their home, but each moment was overshadowed by the absence of Henry's usual warmth and presence. He retreated into an icy silence, his once frequent calls and texts replaced by an unsettling detachment that left Emily feeling adrift. In her moments alone, Emily replayed the scene in their bedroom, trying to make sense of Henry's subdued reaction. Maybe he's processing, she reasoned with herself, clinging to a fragile hope that he would eventually forgive her transgression. She convinced herself that their marriage could weather this storm, that Henry's love for her was strong enough to endure her mistake. Yet beneath the facade of normalcy, tension simmered like a dormant volcano waiting to erupt. Henry's absence spoke volumes, a silent condemnation that weighed heavily on Emily's conscience. She longed to talk to him, to plead for forgiveness, but each time she approached him, he withdrew further into his self-imposed exile. One evening, as Emily set the dinner table with trembling hands, Henry's absence became unbearable. She couldn't ignore the gulf that had grown between them, the rift widening with each passing day, stealing herself. Emily ventured into the study where Henry often retreated after work, hoping to break through the walls he had erected around himself. She found him sitting at his desk, a laptop opened before him, though his attention seemed miles away. The room was bathed in the soft glow of desk lamps, casting shadows across Henry's tired face. He glanced up briefly as Emily entered, his expression unreadable. "Henry," Emily began tentatively, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." Henry's gaze remained fixed on the screen, his fingers tapping absently on the keyboard. He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge her presence beyond a fleeting glance. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Taking a deep breath, Emily pressed on, her voice trembling with the weight of unspoken words. "I'm so sorry," she choked out, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know what came over me. I never meant to hurt you." Henry finally looked up, his eyes meeting her as with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "Emily," he said softly, his voice tinged with a weariness that pierced her heart. "I trusted you. I believed in us." The lump in Emily's throat tightened, her words catching in her chest. She reached out to touch his hand, but he pulled away gently, his gaze dropping to the desk between them. "I don't know if I can forgive this," Henry admitted, his voice barely audible. "I need time." Emily's heart sank at his words, a wave of despair washing over her. She had hoped for forgiveness, for a chance to make amends, but Henry's honesty cut through her hopes like a knife. She retreated from the study, her footsteps heavy with defeat, leaving Henry to grapple with his own turmoil. Days turned into weeks as they continued to navigate the fragile balance of their fractured marriage. Henry retreated further into his work, throwing himself into late nights and early mornings at the office. Emily, desperate to bridge the gap between them, attempted gestures of reconciliation, a favorite meal prepared, a heartfelt note left on his desk, but each attempt was met with a stoic silence that left her heart aching. As time passed, Emily convinced herself that Henry's silence meant forgiveness, that their marriage could survive this betrayal. She pushed aside her guilt, burying it beneath a veneer of normalcy and hope. Little did she know that beneath the surface, Henry's comic exterior masked the plan that would turn their lives upside down once more. 2 weeks passed like a surreal blur for Emily, filled with awkward silences with Henry and the heavy weight of guilt gnawing at her conscience. She tried to bury herself in routine, clinging to the fragile hope that their marriage could somehow recover from her betrayal. But that hope shattered irreparably with a single phone call. It was a Thursday afternoon when Emily's phone rang, its insistent tone slicing through the quiet of their home. She hesitated before answering, a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach as she saw the unfamiliar number on the caller ID. "Hello?" Her voice trembled, already sensing the ominous nature of the call. "Miss Emily Collins?" A gruff voice on the other end confirmed her identity. "This is Sergeant Jacobs from the local precinct. I'm afraid I have some troubling news." Emily's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. "What is it?" she managed to ask, dread pooling in her stomach. "We found a body," Sergeant Jacobs stated bluntly, his words landing like a heavy blow. "In the trunk of your car." Emily's world spun out of control. She felt as though the ground had dropped from beneath her feet, leaving her suspended in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. "No, that can't be." Her voice shook with disbelief and fear. "We need you to come down to the station." "Miss Collins?" Sergeant Jacobs continued, his tone businesslike yet tinged with suspicion. "There are some questions we need to ask you." Numb with shock, Emily mechanically hung up the phone and stumbled through the motions of getting ready. Henry, who had been working in his home office, glanced up as she passed by, his brow furrowing at the sight of her pale face and trembling hands. "Emily, what's wrong?" Henry's voice was laced with concern as he rose from his desk, crossing the room to stand before her. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she struggled to find the words. They found a body. She managed to choke out, her voice breaking with the weight of her confession. Henry's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing with a mix of disbelief and suspicion. "Whose body?" he demanded, his voice low and controlled. In the trunk of my car," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible as she fought to keep herself together. Henry's gaze bore into hers, searching for any sign of deception or guilt. "Emily, what happened?" His voice remained steady, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't know," Emily replied desperately, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I swear, Henry, I don't know how he ended up there." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and the weight of undeniable truth. Henry's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the past weeks. The affair, Emily's strange behavior, the chilling discovery in their own driveway. His heart hammered in his chest as he struggled to comprehend the depth of Emily's betrayal. "We need to go," Henry finally said. His voice clipped as he moved towards the door. Now, the drive to the police station was tense, the air thick with unanswered questions and unspoken accusations. Emily sat beside Henry, her hands folded in her lap as she stared blankly out the window, lost in a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. When they arrived, Sergeant Jacobs greeted them with a stern nod, leading them to a small interview room. Emily's pulse quickened with each step, her mind racing through possible explanations, none of which could erase the damning reality of the body found in her car. "Miss Collins, Mr. Collins," Sergeant Jacobs began, his tone grave as he took a seat opposite them. "I'll be frank with you. We found the body of a man in the trunk of your car earlier today. He's been identified as Michael Turner, your associate." Emily's breath caught in her throat at the mention of Michael's name. She struggled to maintain composure, to push aside the guilt and fear threatening to overwhelm her. "I don't understand," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "The circumstances of Mr. Turner's death are troubling." Sergeant Jacobs continued, his gaze steady on Emily. "And the evidence we've gathered so far points to your involvement." Emily's eyes widened in shock, her mind reeling with disbelief. "No, that's not possible," she protested, her voice rising with desperation. I would never." Henry remained silent beside her, his expression inscrutable as he listened to the accusations against his wife. Inside, turmoil churned, a storm of betrayal, anger, and a gnawing suspicion that Emily's affair had led to something far more sinister than he could have imagined. "We found traces of blood in your car." "Miss Collins," Sergeant Jacobs continued, his voice unwavering, "and witnesses saw you arguing with Mr. Turner shortly before his disappearance." Emily's protests dissolved into stunned silence as the weight of the evidence stacked against her settled like a leaden weight in her chest. She looked to Henry for support, for a shred of belief in her innocence, but found only a cold distance in his eyes that mirrored the devastation of their shattered marriage. As the interrogation continued, Emily struggled to find words to defend herself, to explain the inexplicable. She felt as though she were drowning in a sea of accusations and suspicion, her frantic denials drowned out by the relentless tide of evidence pointing towards her guilt. Hours passed in a blur of questions and accusations. Emily's mind raced, grasping for any semblance of truth or understanding. But in the end, she was left with only one agonizing certainty. Her life had unraveled beyond repair, and the consequences of her betrayal had led her down a path from which there could be no return. Emily sat in the stark interview room at the police station, her hands trembling in her lap as Sergeant Jacobs paced in front of her, his voice measured and probing. "Miss Collins, we have witness statements placing you at the scene of Mr. Turner's disappearance," Sergeant Jacobs stated, his tone implacable. "Can you explain why there was blood found in the trunk of your car?" "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice quivering with uncertainty. I didn't do anything to him." Sergeant Jacobs paused, studying her with a penetrating gaze. "Miss Collins, the evidence doesn't lie," he said firmly. "We found Mr. Turner's body in your car, and the circumstances point to your involvement." Emily's mind raced, searching desperately for an explanation that would absolve her of guilt. But I loved him," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. I couldn't. Love can drive people to extremes." "Miss Collins," Sergeant Jacobs remarked, his voice tinged with skepticism, "especially when trust is broken." "I didn't kill him," Emily insisted, her voice rising with desperation. "I didn't." The interrogation stretched on for hours, each question probing deeper into Emily's relationship with Michael Turner and the events leading up to his disappearance. She recounted their affair, the guilt weighing heavily on her conscience, but maintained vehemently that she had no knowledge of his murder. As the hours passed, Emily's hope dwindled with each piece of evidence Sergeant Jacobs presented, DNA found at the scene, surveillance footage placing her near the crime scene, and witness statements detailing her heated arguments with Michael in the days leading up to his death. The walls closed and around her, suffocating her with the weight of undeniable truth. Throughout the interrogation, Emily stole glances at Henry, who sat beside her with an unreadable expression. His silence spoke volumes, a stark contrast to the supportive husband she had once known. She longed for his reassurance, for a word of belief in her innocence, but he remained aloof, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the interrogation room walls. "Henry, please," Emily pleaded during a brief recess, her voice strained with emotion. "You have to believe me. I didn't kill him." Henry met her gaze with cold detachment, his jaw clenched tightly as if holding back a torrent of unspoken words. "Emily," he finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "I don't know what to believe anymore." His words struck Emily like a physical blow, the final blow to her crumbling hope. She had betrayed him, shattered their marriage with her reckless actions, and now she faced the consequences of a crime she insisted she did not commit. The anguish in Henry's eyes mirrored her own, a reflection of the devastation that had torn their lives apart. Hours turned into days as the investigation deepened, each passing moment driving a deeper wedge between Emily and Henry. He withdrew further into his work, his once familiar presence now a distant shadow in their home. Emily, consumed by fear and despair, clung to the belief that somehow, some way, she could prove her innocence and salvage what remained of their shattered life together. But the evidence continued to mount against her. Forensic reports, witness statements, circumstantial details that painted a damning portrait of her guilt. The media caught wind of the sensational case, splashing Emily's face across headlines that branded her as a cold-blooded killer. Her world imploded, the weight of public scrutiny adding to the suffocating pressure of the investigation. One evening, as Emily sat alone in their dimly lit living room, a knock on the door shattered the uneasy calm. She rose slowly, her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the door. Through the frosted glass, she saw the outline of Sergeant Jacobs and another officer standing on her doorstep. Taking a deep breath, Emily opened the door, her eyes meeting Sergeant Jacobs' steely gaze. "Miss Collins," he began, his voice grave, "we have a warrant for your arrest." Emily's world collapsed around her, the reality of her situation crashing down like a tidal wave. She had denied any involvement in Michael Turner's murder, insisted on her innocence until she was hoarse. But now she faced the consequences of her actions. As the officers led her away in handcuffs, Emily cast one last desperate glance towards Henry, who stood silently in the shadows of their home. His face was a mask of unreadable emotions, betrayal, anger, sorrow. But there was no hint of forgiveness in his eyes. Alone in the back of the police car, Emily stared out the window at the familiar streets of her neighborhood, now tinged with the harsh glare of streetlights and the distant wail of sirens. Her life had unraveled beyond recognition. torn apart by her own choices and the devastating consequences that followed. The journey to the police station was a blur of flashing lights and suffocating silence. Emily clung to the desperate hope that somehow, some way, the truth would come to light, that Henry would see past the accusations and believe in her innocence once more. But as she was booked into custody and led to a holding cell, she knew that the road ahead would be fraught with uncertainty. Her future uncertain and her heart heavy with regret. The days following Emily's arrest blurred into a haze of legal proceedings, media scrutiny, and the overwhelming weight of public opinion. Her once comfortable life had unraveled completely, replaced by the stark reality of a murder charge that hung over her like a dark cloud. The morning of Emily's arraignment dawned cold and gray, matching the heavy atmosphere that settled over the courthouse. Henry sat in the gallery, his eyes fixed on Emily as she entered the courtroom escorted by officers. Her hands were shackled, her expression a mask of stoic determination mixed with fear. The trial had become a media sensation, fueled by sensational headlines and speculation about the motives behind Michael Turner's murder. Emily's face adorned the front pages of newspapers, her life laid bare for public consumption. Cameras flashed incessantly as she took her seat beside her defense attorney, a young, determined woman named Sarah Dawson. "Emily Collins, you are charged with the murder of Michael Turner." The judge's voice boomed, his words echoing through the hushed courtroom. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she listened to the formal charges read aloud, the weight of each word settling heavily upon her shoulders. Sarah Dawson rose to her feet, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges," she stated firmly, her gaze unwavering as she addressed the judge. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Chambers, wasted no time in presenting their case. Witnesses testified about Emily's tumultuous affair with Michael Turner, citing heated arguments and suspicious behavior in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Forensic experts detailed the evidence found at the crime scene and in Emily's car, each piece adding to the mounting case against her. Throughout the proceedings, Henry sat silently in the gallery, his expression unreadable as he listened to the damning testimony and evidence presented against his wife. Reporters clamored for his reaction, but Henry remained stoic, offering no comment and giving no indication of his thoughts on Emily's guilt or innocence. Inside the courtroom, Emily struggled to maintain her composure as the prosecution painted her as a calculating and cold-hearted killer. She listened as witnesses recounted her arguments with Michael, the discovery of his body in her car, and the damning forensic evidence that tied her to the crime scene. Miss Collins, District Attorney Chambers, began during cross-examination, his voice sharp and accusatory. "Can you explain why your DNA was found on the murder weapon?" Emily's throat went dry as she searched for words, her mind racing with the weight of her own innocence. "I don't know," she replied hoarsely, her hands trembling as she faced the relentless scrutiny of the courtroom. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day filled with mounting tension and emotional turmoil. Witnesses were called, evidence presented, and arguments made on both sides of the courtroom. Emily clung to the hope that the truth would prevail, that justice would prevail. But the relentless barrage of evidence against her cast a long shadow over her fragile optimism. In the evenings, Emily retreated to her cell, the stark reality of her situation sinking in with each passing day. She received visits from Sarah Dawson, who worked tirelessly to build her defense and uncover any shred of evidence that could exonerate her client. But the weight of public opinion and the mounting legal battle took its toll on Emily's spirit, leaving her drained and desperate for a glimmer of hope. Henry's absence during the trial weighed heavily on Emily's heart. She longed for his support, for a word of belief in her innocence, but he remained aloof and distant, his silence a barrier between them that she could not breach. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he harbored doubts about her innocence, or if he had already condemned her in his heart. One afternoon, during a recess in the trial, Emily found herself alone with Sarah Dawson in a quiet corner of the courthouse. The tension of the trial hung heavy in the air, but Sarah's unwavering determination offered a faint spark of hope amid the darkness. "Emily, we need to address the evidence," Sarah began, her voice gentle yet firm as she studied her client's weary face. The prosecution's case is strong, but we still have options. Emily nodded silently, her gaze fixed on her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Do you think I have a chance? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her expression thoughtful. It's going to be difficult, she admitted, her tone serious, but we're going to fight this with everything we have. I believe in your innocence, Emily. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she met Sarah's gaze, gratitude and fear warring within her heart. Thank you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. As the trial resumed, Emily steeled herself for the grueling days ahead. The prosecution continued to build their case, each witness and piece of evidence pushing her closer to the brink of despair. But through it all, she clung to Sarah's unwavering belief in her innocence, praying that justice would prevail and that she could reclaim her shattered life once more. The trial continued with relentless intensity, the courtroom of battleground where truth and lies collided in a spectacle that gripped the public's attention. Emily's fate hung in the balance, her hope pinned on the slim chance of redemption amid the overwhelming weight of evidence stacked against her. The trial had stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Each day, a relentless barrage of damning evidence and impassioned arguments that painted Emily as a cold-blooded killer. As the prosecution's case neared its conclusion, Sarah Dawson fought tirelessly to poke holes in their narrative. But the weight of the evidence against Emily seemed insurmountable. Inside the courtroom, Emily sat with a sinking feeling in her chest, her hands trembling as she listened to the closing arguments. District Attorney Chambers painted a vivid picture of Emily's betrayal, her affair with Michael Turner, and the calculated steps she had taken to cover up his murder. The jury's eyes were glued to him, absorbing every word as he built the final pieces of the puzzle that would seal Emily's fate. Sarah Dawson rose to deliver her closing argument, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil roiling beneath the surface. She pleaded with the jury to consider reasonable doubt, to question the prosecution's narrative and the circumstantial nature of the evidence against Emily. But the weight of public opinion and the sensationalized media coverage loomed large, casting a shadow of doubt over Emily's chances of acquittal. As the jury retired to deliberate, Emily's mind raced with a whirlwind of emotions, fear, desperation, and a flicker of hope that justice would prevail. Hours stretched into eternity as she awaited their verdict. Her heart pounding with each passing moment, Sarah Dawson sat beside her, offering quiet reassurances and squeezing her hand in a gesture of solidarity. Finally, the jury returned to the courtroom, their faces solemn as they filed back into their seats. Emily held her breath, her eyes fixed on their impassive expressions as the four persons stood to deliver the verdict. We find the defendant, Emily Collins, guilty of murder in the first degree. The four-person's voice echoed through the courtroom, sending a shockwave of disbelief and despair through Emily's shattered world. The room erupted into chaos as Emily's supporters gasped in disbelief while reporters clamored to capture the moment for the evening news. Sarah Dawson's face fell, her shoulders slumping in defeat as she whispered words of consolation to her devastated client. Emily felt as though the ground had dropped out from beneath her feet, leaving her suspended in a nightmarish reality she couldn't wake up from. The weight of the guilty verdict pressed down upon her like a suffocating blanket, crushing her hopes of reclaiming her life and leaving her facing a bleak future behind bars. Henry, who had watched the trial unfold with detached interest, sat stoically in the gallery, his expression unreadable as he witnessed the culmination of his carefully orchestrated plan. His revenge against Emily for her betrayal and the devastation she had brought upon their marriage was now complete. In the days that followed Emily's conviction, as she awaited sentencing in a cold, sterile cell, a series of clandestine revelations began to surface. Whisperers in the corridors of power, anonymous tips to investigative journalists, hints of a darker truth that lurked beneath the surface of Emily's conviction. It started with a cryptic email sent to Sarah Dawson's office, an encrypted file containing detailed records of Henry's clandestine activities, bank transactions, travel itineraries, and communications that painted a damning portrait of Henry's involvement in Michael Turner's murder and the framing of Emily. Sarah Dawson, her determination reignited by the startling revelations, embarked on a desperate quest for justice. She pieced together Henry's meticulously planned scheme. The discovery of Emily's affair, his decision to manipulate her infidelity into a vehicle for revenge, and the careful steps he had taken to orchestrate her downfall. Meanwhile, Emily languished in her prison cell, grappling with the devastating realization that she had been betrayed not only by her own actions, but by the man she had once trusted with her heart. The knowledge that Henry had framed her for murder had engineered her conviction and subsequent imprisonment, gnawed at her spirit like a relentless predator. Months passed as Sarah Dawson amassed evidence, mounting a legal battle to overturn Emily's conviction and expose Henry's role in the conspiracy. The media, once captivated by Emily's sensational trial, now turned its attention to the unfolding scandal, the downfall of a prominent businessman, and the woman he had ruthlessly sacrificed in his pursuit of vengeance. And then, just as the tide seemed irreversible, a breakthrough came. An anonymous tip that led investigators to a remote villa on the coast of Spain, where Henry had been living under an assumed identity. The authorities swooped in, apprehending Henry as he attempted to flee the country, his carefully constructed facade crumbling around him. Back in California, Emily received news of Henry's capture with a mixture of disbelief and bitter satisfaction. As Sarah Dawson presented the newly uncovered evidence to the courts, the wheels of justice turned once more. Henry's elaborate web of deceit unraveled under scrutiny, his crimes laid bare for the world to see. In a dramatic turn of events, Henry was brought to trial, facing charges of conspiracy, murder, and perjury. Emily, now vindicated of the murder charge that had haunted her, watched from the courtroom gallery as Henry faced the consequences of his actions. The trial of Henry Collins became another media spectacle, but this time, the spotlight shifted to him, the man who had orchestrated a chilling plot of revenge and manipulation. Witnesses testified, evidence was presented, and Henry's defense crumbled in the face of overwhelming proof. As the trial drew to a close, Henry's fate was sealed, a lifetime behind bars, the price he would pay for his crimes. Emily, now free from the shadow of her wrongful conviction, stood outside the courthouse with Sarah Dawson at her side, watching his Henry was led away in handcuffs. The sun set over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city skyline. A symbolic end to a harrowing chapter in Emily's life. She had endured betrayal, loss, and the agonizing weight of injustice, but through it all, she had found strength in the pursuit of truth and the unwavering support of those who believed in her innocence. As Emily looked towards the future, she knew that scars of the past would always linger, but she also carried with her a newfound resilience, a determination to rebuild her life, to reclaim her voice, and to never again be silenced by the shadows of her own mistakes or the malice of those who sought to destroy her. And so, with Sarah Dawson by her side and the promise of a new beginning on the horizon, Emily Collins stepped forward into the embrace of a world that had tested her resolve and, against all odds, had shown her the power of redemption and the enduring triumph of justice.